Oh, can I?
I can have this one.
Sweet. I get the cool thing.
So we're here basically to fanboy about the next game that's being talked about, which we're both really big fans of, but it's a bit of a cult game, so we figured we'd talk a bit about why it is important. So Dungeons of Fate is also sort of a token action game at Wordplay, and the reason it's being included is, one, it does some really interesting stuff with co-op and narrative, and two, it does some really interesting stuff with combining action with narrative.
You'll notice that most of the games being shown here are single-player experiences, and most of the games being talked about. I mean, we just played Porpentine's game, and that was awesome, but you don't really see any games being shown right now that are like, you sit on a couch with a bunch of your friends and play through a narrative adventure. That's exactly what Dungeons of Fate is.
So yeah, it's part action RPG, it's part randomized choose-your-own-adventure. It's a game you can play cooperatively with 3 other friends, and you can basically sit down and have like a complete adventure in about the same time you could play a board game, so about like an hour-ish.
It really feels like you're sitting around like a campfire telling stories and being fun with each other.
And every once in a while playing Zelda in between.
Yeah, exactly. It's really awesome.
And it's sort of a handful of games that are inspired by an old Japanese life sim game called Princess Maker, which is kind of like, it's a problematic game.
Yeah.
It's kind of a poorly designed game, but it's full of cool ideas, and a bunch of people, including Dungeons of Fate, are doing really neat stuff, just sort of distilling the parts that work in that game.
If anybody knows games like not Dungeons, but like The Yogg or Long Live the Queen or Monster
Princess
Loves
Roguelike.
You, Princess Roguelike, there's a lot of games now that are taking parts, but Dungeons of Fate is kind of the first one we saw.
And I think it does some of the most interesting stuff with it.
Because this was made back in 2009?
Yeah, it is ancient, especially for a jam game, which is the other thing.
2010 is ancient.
It is in terms of a jam game. To be talking about a jam game up on stage, and what we mean by jam game is it was made, I think, in around a month, something like that.
Yeah,
Where
for
the
like one
creators-
small competition.
But yeah, what makes it special is it's really more than the sum of its parts. Like, each of the elements isn't new, but combined, it really did something special that I haven't seen anywhere else.
Like I mean, back when it was made, like, morality was a big thing in games. Like, oh yeah, you have your sliding scale of like how good or evil you are. In Dungeons of Fate, like, it's just you do something and stuff happens and the game is never judging you for it, but you can definitely have terrible consequences and awesome consequences for your actions.
Yeah, you can be a bad person or a good person, but it doesn't sort of track it. It just sort of organically handles it.
Yeah, which is really nice, and still you don't see that enough in like more action-y or like. You see that a lot in the interactive fiction here, but like Dungeons of Fate does
Being
it.
an action game as well. It's unusual as an action game that does that. And it integrates narrative stuff into cooperative gameplay in a way that, like, that's a really hard problem that has generally usually fails, and they've kind of succeeded with it.
Yeah.
And it's just, like, in general, kind of a perfect single-sitting co-op experience in a way that no other game that I've come across is.
Yeah. Basically, I mean, it had a huge influence on the Yogg. If you play Dungeons of Fate, you'll realize I just ripped everything off. Because, like, we only had 3 months to make the Yogg, so yeah, sorry guys. Thanks though. Yeah.
You did add Emily Carroll's beautiful art.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah.
And your writing, which is okay.
My writing's okay, I guess.
And it's also going to be a big influence on the next game that Spooky Squid, my game company, is going to be working on next, which is sort of a Fate-like, a Dungeons of Fate game with a contemporary high school supernatural setting.
Yeah, we're coining the term Fate-like right now. All right, so Fate-like is going to become a thing, and what Fate-likes are going to be are multiplayer, choose-your-own-adventure.
With stats and action sometimes?
Yeah, yeah. No, well, we're not there yet.
We're at least 5 to 10 years away from Fate-like likes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean.
But yeah, it's very few games you play, and especially jam games, you play and you go, this should be a genre. This isn't just like one game. This should be a whole thing.
Yeah. It's just the modular storytelling, all the little bits like randomly cobble themselves together. It's great.
Yeah, we love the
Honestly,
shit out of this game, basically.
Yeah, basically. this 5-year-old jam game.
Yeah. That I've it's been played at my house since it launched up until now. It's on regular play amongst me and my friends.
Yeah.
It's got a lot of lasting time for a jam game.
Yeah, so we're really excited to have Tanya and Brent talk to us about their process of making this game many years ago.
And we should mention Tanya is actually working on the spiritual successor to Dungeons of Fate, which is Moon Hunters, which just recently got kickstarted and looks amazing.
Yeah, so give it a hand for Tanya and Brent.
Yep.
Hey, thanks, guys, right?
Let's see, how can I stitch it? There we go, okay. This is the mic.
Yeah.
Hello? Hi. I'm Brent Ellison. This is Tanya Short, happens to also be my wife and co-collaborator on many video game projects. I was the designer, the system designer and programmer on this. Tanya was in charge of basically all the content, all the level design, all the writing, things like that.
First, thank you very much to Damien and Miguel for such a blushy, flattering introduction. I don't think I've blushed so hard in my life.
Yeah, so this is a bit of a sort of retro post-mortem on a very, very niche game. Oops, sorry. I think maybe it's been downloaded 35,000 times or something like that, so it's not this huge thing, but I guess it's had some influence here, which is pretty exciting to me. So I'll give you guys an intro about what exactly this sort of game is. Okay, I'm getting closer to the mic. All right, so it's as I said, a 4-player cooperative dungeon crawler and time management sim. So basically what you do is you run through the game and, ooh. Okay, I thought that was a different slide. Okay. All right, so basically what happens is that the game is part a sort of gauntlet-like dungeon crawler with your friends and part a town management sim where you're deciding what to do with your time. And I'll give you a quick glimpse at the gameplay so it can be clear what that means. Oh no, here we go.
So this is one of the dungeons in the game. This is the manor of a rich individual that's been haunted, clearly. So we see 3 players, a wizard and 2, it looks like the newbie class. They're beating up monsters, and this is kind of the Zelda section that they were talking about. It's very simple controls. There's only 2 buttons for abilities, and you can move around.
Yep, and you share on the same keyboard.
Yeah.
So far, so basically traditional, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But then, in between the dungeons, we kind of squish the whole town into one screen, and they're trying to figure out where they're going to go train.
Yeah, so there's a series of different places here, and there's a certain amount of time that you have in the game, and you decide what you're going to do every week. So they're going around to places like a graveyard and a mage's mansion and things like that. They're going to get there eventually.
The idea being that at the end of your time limit, the big boss monster will come in and you have to defeat it. So it's a pretty simple, traditional adventure story.
Yeah. But when you go into these, each person is basically getting their own little mini adventure, and this serves as the entirety of the character progression in the entire game. So as you can see, this person has gone to the town hall, and they're having a little event. And the events and sort of the way that crafts your character is what basically sort of made this game feel unique and stand out.
So we can...
All right, so I'll get a little bit into the structure of how this thing worked. Okay. Yeah, sure. Okay, so.
Oh, the audio is still going.
Oh, there's audio.
Sorry.
Okay, all right. So the structure of the entire game, and this is laid out from the start, is that basically you start the game and you name your character and you start in a little intro dungeon, and that just gets you used to how you move around. You learn that there are events in the dungeons that the whole party gets to vote on what they do, and then you pop into a town for a few weeks. You work around in town, you choose events, you progress your character, you pick classes, things like that. Then you go and pick a dungeon. Then you go back to town, pick a dungeon, blah, 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 blah. But the whole time you know that eventually, at the end of these 4 months, the Bone Lord is coming and he's going to destroy you all. Now keep in mind that this was 2009, and so it was a bit early in the era of permanent permanency in a short-term context. So it ended up actually having a bit more sort of resonance because of that, which I'll talk a bit about later. Now, the truth is that Tanya and I actually both come from a traditional games industry background. So we were both working at Funcom Oslo, which is an MMO company. And I actually still work in MMOs. So I originally conceived of this as sort of like an XBLA game, which...
It might be one of the only Jan games ever to have a concept document.
Yes, absolutely. So I had written up a concept document, and I was going to prepare it and show it to my bosses, and I did, and then I never heard anything back, so I was like, oh, well, this is an MMO company. They probably don't care about couch games anyway. So when this TIG Source assembly competition came along, I decided to just make it. Now, the cool thing about the assembly contest, whoop. Oh, sorry. The cool thing about the assembly contest was that what it was that artists made a bunch of art, audio guys made a bunch of sound, and then you were expected to make games using only those assets, and you weren't really supposed to talk to them ahead of time. So somebody called Oryx has made this amazing sprite set that everybody loved, and it turned out to be perfect for this sort of game. And in fact, this sprite set is still being used. You can see it on Steam to this day in MMOs.
If you think we look a lot like a bunch of other games, that's why. It's
Yeah,
all
yeah,
because
yeah.
of this competition.
Yeah. So basically, that was a perfect opportunity to actually just put this game together and forget what the company I was working for cared about. I did change the name because it was originally called Hero Maker, which is something maybe I'll hold on to. But that way they couldn't, take it and own it or anything like that.
Don't steal it.
Yeah. So the thing is that this whole game is basically based off of what I felt was missing in most video games from traditional tabletop role-playing. So the sort of experience statement, which is what the entire game is built around, is that this should be an epic role-playing campaign in under an hour. And most RPGs basically, they take the most boring parts of D&D. They take the rolling and they take the numbers and things like that. And so I wanted to sort of get the experience of D&D and basically pull it out of the players, get them to engage in behavior that feels like what it's like playing a full-on epic campaign in a very short period of time. And so, to that end, we invoked certain elements that we felt would really play up that experience. And those elements are the consequences to your actions, a feeling of identity, a strong pacing, and a strong sense of humor, which a lot of the best D&D campaigns do. So I'll start off by talking about consequence. So I want to go through this quickly because, of course, right now there are so many games out there that are based on you playing for a short period of time and then having permadeath, right? But in 2009, it was sort of very early in the roguelike renaissance. And not to mention, it was easier for me to program if I didn't have to save. So what kind of we did here is that, as I stated, you go from the beginning to the Bone Lord, and there is no going back. I'm very conscious of what save scumming does to the feeling of a game. So I wanted to make sure that you were always, always, always moving forward. There's no game over either, because anytime you die, you basically just have a missed opportunity. If you're in a dungeon and then you drop dead, then you just go back to the town and the sequence continues. That means you only have one shot at the final boss, and any choices you make in terms of like encounters you come along with are permanent for this playthrough. And so that helps sort of create the sense of a D&D campaign where you can't go back on any of your choices. But what I think, one thing that we really did that ended up being unique, and it's something that like all games should do, is that we often have surprising consequences. And so a lot of the times when you play a game, people have programmed things in, and they want to get maximum use out of every single system you have. And so they make sure to squeeze that system dry and use it in every possible way. And as a result, as you're playing a game, you sort of end up basically feeling like you can understand everything that's going to happen as you go along. And while this is kind of satisfying, you know you're always going to get this kind of reward and this thing is always going to happen. It's not interesting, right? Like once you've totally internalized the rules of a game, then the game ceases to be, surprising. So one of the goals that we did was to make sure that there are a few things in the game that can happen that change your perception of what can happen in the game and sort of create the idea that you don't know. There could be something anywhere. So as an example, we have these events that you go to, and you go and train at locations, right? And you can go to the Mage's Tower and go train with the Archmage, and your intelligence always go up. And that's pretty predictable. But we had one place, which is the Town Hall. And when you go there, you increase your charm. But after you've been at the Town Hall a while, if you go there and you have a high charm, they elect you mayor, which completely changes the way that the Town Hall works. And this was something that, like, the moment that sort of pops up, you wonder, what? I didn't think that that could work. The rules of the game were so obviously clear before. What else could happen in the game? And it's the sort of thing that I think should be tried more.
I mean, it's not only about what happens when you make a choice, it's about feeling like you might never be able to know what could happen when you make a choice. Because that's how the real world works. When you make a choice, you can't know exactly what will happen. And I think there's a certain charm in unknowability, especially in a play space that feels safe.
Yep.
And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But part of what was interesting about unknowable consequences is that players never felt like they were going to be unduly punished for going a little bit outside their safety zone.
Yep. Obviously, there's a right and a wrong way to do this, but as long as these consequences are generally positive, interesting, and can be reacted to, it can basically change your impression of the game.
Right. So one thing that made the world feel extra dense, even though it was quite small, there's only one town and a choice of 4 dungeons, was the fact that one story thread would pick up somewhere. And even if it's an extremely minimal story thread, the story thread might be as simple as a woman lost her ring. Like what sounds like the most boring fetch quest in the world in a normal game suddenly becomes interesting when the fact that you just talked to a woman, she mentioned she lost her ring, and then when you're out adventuring, you're like, oh wait, that's there. What else does that mean about all the other things that I read? And so having threads that kind of show up unexpectedly throughout the game was part of the appeal of the consequential density of the world. This is more of a design technical note, but we used a lot of reusable content where Brent would just make a little element that then I could insert in the game wherever I wanted. So it was a nice collaborative tool that I was able to use not only the art that Oryx made, but also little features that Brent had made and be creative separate from him.
Yep. And of course, as I mentioned, we both come from a traditional games industry background, so we're used to interacting with these sorts of things and understanding how that works in a large team environment.
So yeah, I don't know if all of you have seen Moon Hunters. We recently had a very successful Kickstarter. I'm the designer on that project, and part of what I'm taking from Dungeons of Fate isn't just the structure of it, but also the idea that there are secrets and unknowable consequences. So in Moon Hunters, it elevates the Dungeons of Fate idea of something will happen if you make a choice, like punch a guy. And then in Moon Hunters, you'll get a reputation for being vengeful or some other high-flown word that we would associate with a hero of legend. So the idea is you build a reputation, you get remembered a certain way, and I think that that really fits really well with the Dungeons of Fate idea of not knowing what exactly will happen when you do something, but it will be interesting. Yeah.
Okay, so another element that's sort of taken from D&D is the importance of identity. So in a lot of these, in a lot of back in the day, like 4-player couch co-op games, you don't really have a big sense of your character as separate from the group. It's nice to have a little bit of a combat role that you can work with, but you don't really get into the nitty-gritty into your specific character. Instead, it's too busy telling the story of everybody else all at once. And so I feel that this is another thing that's often lost from D&D, and identity is actually, to me, one of the most important things in a lot of the games that I work on professionally as well, because since I work on MMOs, identity is one of the #1 things you take going into a game and sort of craft. So we've got some of the traditional stuff with the identity because we put 14 character classes into the game since we had about that many sprites that we could work with. But that allowed each person to, you started out as a grunt and then you grew into one of these, but picking that character and then that character having a role and a combat role where you get behind the knight with your arrows and things like that. Like that obviously makes it easy for a character to, or for a person to feel different from the people around them. But the big thing that we added was the sort of meaningful character advancement and individual stories. So back in the day, in early Dungeons & Dragons, training was a huge thing. It was a role-playing opportunity. You didn't just, get your experience, write down your character sheet that you are now level 2, and assign your points. It was like, okay, you've earned the right to now go out and find the right trainers, pay for the opportunity. You role-play potentially one-on-one with your GM, about all the things that happened while you were training at fighter school or in a logger camp or whatever. And so that was really important to us creating that epic feeling in this game, was making it feel like, or rather making very clear what your individual story in your training was. And so, yes? Yes. Yeah, so that is what has to do with the individual stories in the context of a larger narrative, which Tanya will talk about.
Yeah, I love D&D when I can actually go have my own little separate story that everybody gets to watch. And so, like in D&D, when everybody goes around, okay, so what do you do today? And that was kind of captured in Dungeons of Fate, and the idea that, oh, well, my character's going to go do this. And we deliberately made it exclusive, that only one player could go into a given location. So it's not that we went farming, it's no, I went farming and you did something else, and that defines us differently. And I think this actually plays over well between both co-op experiences, but also replayability, that you feel like your choices have to be different. And the way that you grow into a hero is different, not only from your friends, but also yourself in past lives. And then the way that I actually wrote the individual text choices in the town, this is kind of a subtle thing, but in the town, it talks to you like a person who could get away with something secretly, and the rest of the group doesn't know about it, even though they're watching it on the screen. But in theory, it's you doing this thing, not you all doing this thing. And so the wild events tend to be, what do you all do about this ghost? Whereas in the event, it's, in the town, it's like, what do you specifically do when this guy says this? Which I think gives a little bit more ownership as well. And then I just wanted to note that the endings don't really make a lot of sense, but that's okay. We deliberately decided to have more endings that were more unique, rather than worry too much about them being overly long or overly detailed or overly sensical. And I think that's probably going to carry over to Moon Hunters. But we'll see. We had at least 30 endings.
Yeah, just to give a little context, you basically get your personalized ending regardless of whether you defeat the final boss or not. And the whole intention there is to basically cap off a complete story. It doesn't matter if you won or lost, you had a story. And that's basically what you get from tabletop role-playing as well.
No matter what, something interesting happened to you.
Yeah.
And you are cool.
Okay. Another one is pacing. And of course, this is important for any video game, any movie, etc. In D&D, you have a referee, or dungeon master nowadays, who his job is to keep the thing moving. Uh-oh.
Just keep talking.
Okay, all right.
Keep it moving.
Yes. What we were trying to do here required some really intricate juggling, though, because we had one screen, basically one keyboard as well. And we needed to tell a single group story and 4 individual stories. So it was really important to find ways to always, always, always keep moving the story forward. So this is, of course, a flip side. Another benefit of the consequential design and structure that we use is that the game always moves forward. So sure, you lost out on this opportunity, but look, you can go hang out in town now and do some other stuff. And also the fact that you lose these things is less of a problem in a multiplayer context. Because if you know Dwarf Fortress, for example, there's the motto, failure is fun, right? But failure is even more fun when you do it together. And I'll just give another little note on the actual dungeon designs and things themselves, is that I made sure to make it very clear, well, Tanya and I both made sure to make it very clear exactly the right critical path to go through any dungeon, which was denoted by those arrows, and also where these sort of optional hard segments were with blood and skulls and things.
Just for anybody who doesn't have a design background, the critical path is where the player must go through. And so if you don't choose to pursue the ugly blood and gore corridors, you'll just get to the end and you'll have a great time. And so that was definitely part of keeping it moving.
Yep. And in additional, in the sort of like combat mechanics, I took some hints. Basically, when you're trying to design these sorts of like forward-moving levels, then you always want to make sure that the player behavior is being encouraged in a way that tells them also to move forward. Like even back in the day, I think it was Zelda was one of the first games where you got health from killing enemies, and the whole idea was like, okay, in order to advance forward, or in order to restore yourself, then you need to do what the game is basically about. And so we put in these sort of Left 4 Dead inspired healing pools that there's always a certain number of them in the level, and you basically, if you lose your friends, then you go forward, you find the healing pool, and that is what allows you to keep going forward and get them back. And I made sure that even though, in a traditional fantasy setting, you always have things like clerics and things like that, who technically you could sit around for 3 weeks and they will heal you to full. But the way that we implemented our healing systems for the clerics was that when you lose health, you have a certain amount of time to recharge it back, just to make sure that there was some sort of healing and medical element there, but that it didn't stop you from moving forward. You don't have to wait for a cooldown or anything. Okay, but the most exciting, most important part relevant to this actual thing today is how we did the pacing for the overall narrative in the events. So we described the structure earlier on, and having that structure be clear and having that structure be presented to the player regularly with sort of an epic ending that's always coming forward is that, well, you can satisfy that structure. But we took that structure into our events as well in a very, very, very strict fashion. So every single event basically has an intro, tells you what the problem is, gives you a choice. It has a flavor result, like you did this, therefore this, and then it has a stat result. You got this much intellect and this much money and things like that. And so since every single one takes this exact same structure with a very limited word count, it keeps it snappy, which is very important when you have 3 other people who are mildly interested in what you're doing, but not completely invested the way you are. Oh, and Tanya will go a bit more into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of why this structure works and part of why the humor works in the game is this structure. That players know when an event box pops up, they have a certain expectation of what will happen. There's a lot of humor in old D&D. I really recommend just looking up old D&D monsters.
Yeah, Fiend Folio.
Right, so this is actually one of Brent's goals was not just to bring the players into the game, but kind of the opposite of bringing the game out into the player's space. So it was really, although you can play it alone, it is so much more satisfying to play it together because there are things to discuss. There are decisions to be made, and you make them together. So this is an example of voting on a choice. This is actually a choice in that manner earlier where there's a snake, and it's like talking to you, but it's like mean. And so you have to like defend yourself somehow. These guys are all voting on Stomp, which is a little bit mean, but they all voted together. And if you are outvoted or there's ties, there's mechanics for that. But the point is that players have a reason to debate, and they have a space that's sociable. And the best way to make people sociable and cooperative, I've found, is to make them laugh. So, next. First, the low resolution is super helpful. And for Moon Hunters, I'm probably going to keep the text super short because then people are more patient.
Not just pixel art, but...
It's not just the pixel, what?
But a short amount of words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, a short amount of words as well. Yes, but it's important not to get too deep into philosophy and ethics and moral quandaries, in my opinion, if you're having a cooperative game. Because as soon as people think like, oh no, I'm ruining my soul, I think they're much less likely to just like banter and debate and have a nice time and keep moving forward.
If that's your goal.
Given that that's our goal.
Yeah. No offense.
Next. Right, so there's only 2 options. And the first thing that anybody ever asks me typically if they're a writer in interactive fiction is why only 2 choices? And that was a deliberate limitation so that people can very quickly get the size of the situation, make their decision together or alone as it is. And the important thing for me is that when you read something like this, like you're in the graveyard, and this is actually a situation where the graveyard keeper comes over and says, what are you doing? Because you're digging up graves, getting gold, obviously. And you feel like you know what this will do. You know that apologize is safer, but maybe less lucrative. And so that kind of logic, it's important to follow through and generally do that. Like generally, I didn't subvert. Apologizing is generally safer, but lower risk. But lower reward than bribe. And although occasionally I would twist it, It was more often the joke would be that I'd exaggerate it. Like if you bribe him, he'll say, "Oh yeah, definitely, I'm into bribes," and that's funnier than saying, "Oh, how dare you?" Like it's just the next point would be, oh, that's the next slide. Right. So it is these expectations. So while cleaning out the creature cages, a toad is extra squirmy. There's also a slide missing where it says, "Kiss me, kiss me." And what do you do? Do you kiss the frog? That sounds risky, but interesting. Or do you clean it? And if you choose to clean, it says you clean, but then you also learn about the lying Guatemalan hopper, and you gain intellect. And what's interesting about this is that we found that generally, if you twist it or exaggerate it, it's funnier when everyone's laughing together. We had very, very few punishments for taking a risk. So this was a situation where we could make it, you kiss the frog and then you get a disease and then your stats go down and like, ha ha ha, DMs are having a great time. And everybody's laughing at the idiot who did that. But if you make it instead, you kiss the frog and it's gross and you get a disease that grows your muscles +2, then everyone's laughing and you're like eager to try something weird the next time. So that's kind of the attitude that all of the events take. They're all kind of like, yeah, just keep doing that.
Yeah, the very few negative events basically exist to keep you worried about the choices you make.
Yeah, like there is one event where, so if you're in hell, don't walk up to death. Just don't. Like, you should know that that's a bad idea. So there's a few like that keep you guessing, but generally the mechanics of the game are very, very positive. So as a whole, looking back at Dungeons of Fate now, it's been a few years since we worked on it at all. We've looked at the identity of the player and how that gave them a reason to keep playing, the consequences to any decisions that the players made, keeping the players moving was super important, and then the playfulness of the game was also part of its success as a story, in my opinion. And do we have anything else? Is that the final slide?
Are there any questions?
Thank you then.
Oh, yeah.
Yay, thank you.